Our next topic is understanding the Earth's origin and evolution. Since the formation of the solar system, our sun and the planetary objects orbiting around it have been in a state of perpetual change. Earth, the only known planetary body with liquid water oceans, silica-rich continents and abundant life, formed from these primordial materials. Collections at NMNH and the scientists who study them are the centre of many questions related to the Earth and the solar system, which we will hear about from our next speaker, Dr. Laura Waters. But allow me to introduce her first. Dr. Laura Waters is interested in understanding the processes that govern the evolution, differentiation, and stratification of Earth's continents through petrographic, geochemical, and experimental studies of volcanics erupted in subduction zones and rifts. Laura received a Peter Buck postdoctoral fellowship from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in 2015 that provided her with stability and funds to support her research. The Peter Buck postdoctoral fellowship and mentorship she received in the Department of Mineral Sciences provided her with an excellent foundation for her career today. Laura is currently an assistant professor at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, where she has a group of 4 graduate students working on projects related to crystallization kinetics in rhyolites and understanding the impacts of changes in ice sheet thickness on volcanic interruptions in Antarctica, determining the role of fluid salinity in mobilizing rare earth elements from monazite and characterizing rock formations and to understand their potential to become CO2 sequestration sites. It is my pleasure to welcome Laura to give her presentation today.
Thank you for that introduction. And so my talk today focuses on why Earth's continents are missing a layer, and I want to give you a perspective from obsidians. So Earth is unique for a couple things, life included, but when we think about the solid Earth and its properties, it's unique for liquid water, an oxygenated atmosphere, plate tectonics, and 2 types of crust that forms our ocean basins and crust that forms our continents. And the continental crust is what I want to talk about today. So if I asked you, what are continents made of? Right? Oops, sorry about that little typo there. So what if they're made of, or how would you find out? Well, we could go to places where areas of the upper crust are exposed on the surface of the Earth. So this would be like Yosemite, and we could measure the rocks there, and we'd find that they have between 60 and 72 weight% silica. And so I know we've been listening to talks about birds and lichens, right? And we think about things in terms of mass, right, and grams and length. And so when we think about rocks, we need to talk about a chemical index, and so for that we'll use silica. So in a similar strategy, like if we go to Yosemite, we know what the upper crust is made of. But if we want to know what's in the lower crust, we have to go to places where arcs are exhumed on Earth. So this would be places like the Khoisan arc that was pushed on top of the continent during continental collision. We can use the same approach and measure the rocks there, and we'd find that they have between 50 and 58 weight% silica. Now, as a final method, we can actually analyze glacial deposits. And so glaciers go across continents and they pulverize all the rocks that are underneath them. And so glaciers effectively average all the rocks that you have on a continent. So if you can measure the glacial deposits, you know the average rock type over which they traversed. Now, another thing you could do is to conduct a seismic study. So this is results from a study by Christensen and Mooney, and they were looking at the average seismic structure of continents. And I hope you can see that they found it was stratified, right? So slow velocities at the top, fast velocities at the bottom, and that means that the continental crust density increases downward. And when you combine that with the chemical record, you see that the continental crust is stratified, right? It's stratified in terms of its silica content, its mineralogy. And as a geochemist and someone that studies volcanoes, when I look at this, I see that the upper crust is made of dacites, the middle crust is made of andesites. Now, those are the 2 most common volcanic rocks that erupted at subduction zones. And then when you look at the lower crust, you have basaltic andesites and basalts. Now, when we look at this continental section, you can see that it's stratified very strongly in terms of silica content. But if we look at the rock record, we all could know that this continent, our continents all on Earth, are actually missing a layer. So for some reason, the continents don't have a rhyolitic layer, a layer that's composed of greater than 70 weight % silica. So my question for this talk is, why does differentiation stop? And that's to say that why is it when we go to a place like Yosemite National Park, why do the rocks kind of stop at 70 weight % silica? Why don't they get any more enriched? Another way of saying that is, why don't we have any large plutonic bodies equivalent to these high silica rhyolites? Now, if you're not sure, like, oh, okay, what is a high silica rhyolite? Well, these are probably the most differentiated rocks on Earth. They have over 75 weight % silica, and some examples include the Huckleberry Ridge Tuff, the Lava Creek Tuff. Now, those erupted from Yellowstone, and the Bishop Tuff, and you can see that they occur in enormous volumes. And when these eruptions happen, the ash that's produced and goes into the air covers almost half of the continent, right? And so you see these are huge. Just as an example, that Lava Creek Tuff, 1,000 cubic kilometers is extremely hard to visualize. That amounts to a layer. If that eruption happened over that kind of diamond of DC, it would be 5 kilometers deep, and that's about 33 Washington National Monuments. So this is a huge volume. So we know these rocks, we know these high silica rocks can occur in enormous volumes. So why doesn't it happen here? And now that I've told you it's not here, it is, but in very sparse amounts. And so where you find high silica rhyolite is as these apatite dikes inside of arc batholiths. And so these apatite dikes here are these white, sugary textured lines, kind of in that photo. They're finely crystalline. And in 2008, Alan Glazner analyzed maybe 40 or so of these veins, and he found they have these really unique geochemical fingerprints. And so on that plot there, we have the rare earth elements, and you can see that the dark colors, they have this unique kind of seagull shape, right? The aplites have this rounded shape in terms of their geochemical fingerprint. So what you should take away from this is that the aplites are actually missing from the erupted record. So for some reason, these rocks are not actually erupting, though we observe them in these batholiths. So why don't they erupt? Well, one of the first things we started looking at was maybe it has something to do with their composition. And so these rocks are made mostly of 4 components. They're bulk chemistry, so this is like what you would get if you analyze the whole rock compositions, is mostly made of silica, aluminum, sodium, potassium. And now what's really cool about these 4 components is that when you mix them together, they have this really interesting behavior. And I want to show you on this phase diagram. So this is a diagram that just shows general stability, and you can see there's a combination of these components at that star that corresponds to something that we in petrology call a minimum. And this is a composition that can go from 100% liquid to 100% solid within a single change of 1 degree C. So it's as if you were cooling off, right? And the second that you hit, on that plot, maybe 10, 50 degrees C, all of a sudden you turn into a stone, right? No time lapse. If you take this position, the minimum, and you broadcast it through temperature and pressure space, it turns into this line, right? So there's a line in temperature pressure space where if you cross it, you go from 100% melt to a complete rock, right? 100% stone. Now, this is for an ideal liquid, and the rocks we're talking about today have a teeny amount of iron and a teeny amount of calcium, and the effect of that is to bring the liquidus away from the solidus. So you have this interval where at above the liquidus, you have 100% liquid, below you have a liquid and crystals, and then you have 100% solid below the solidus. And so the idea is, well, maybe these rocks, it's something about their bulk composition that a small change in temperature or a small change in pressure causes them to freeze or turn into stone in place. So, and then we started looking around and say, well, that can't be it, because there's these other rocks. These are obsidians from Glass Mountain, and these were samples that I worked on as part of my Buck Fellowship. And they have almost exactly the same composition as the apatite dikes. But you guys can see from this picture, there are less than 3% crystals overall, and that means they're 97% glass. These were once a liquid. And so there's something happening with obsidians instead of apatites that's enabling them to erupt. So we wanted to figure out what that was. In order to, as a geologist and someone that looks at rocks, we kind of have to document what's in them. And so one of the things we look at is the mineral assemblage. So we know these rocks have less than 1% sanidine. They have a huge range in composition, and they have, as their crystallinity is distributed, they have sparse, large crystals. Okay, so that's the observations that I use to sort of understand how these things were able to erupt. Now, just for brevity here, Ben Andrews and I found that the best way to explain this range of composition is that these crystals must have formed as water was being lost from the melt. And so that's how we get this huge range in composition. But the rest of the talk, I want to explain to you how we can use these two observations to figure out how these obsidians erupted. And essentially what we'll talk about are kinetic processes. So how do you grow a large crystal? Well, if you think about the different mechanisms you have in nature, the first one is maybe you could grow it if you had a lot of time, right? You have a lot of time, you could build a big crystal. And for that, we need to cool slowly in a magma chamber. The second hypothesis we wanted to test actually came from a set of experimental studies. And so these two studies by Lofgren and Fenn, they started experiments. So they recreated magma chambers in the lab, and they started experiments from above the liquidus. So they started in a field where there were no crystals present at all. And then they cooled their experiments down, and they grew these absolutely gigantic crystals. So this is their run product down here, and you can see the scale. So those crystals are 1 millimeter long, which, you may not think, oh, that's not too big, but you can see that with your naked eye. And they grew them in 60 hours. And so we wanted to test this. And so Ben and I put together some experiments. And so to do these experiments, we used horizontally oriented cold seal pressure vessels. And this is sort of what it looks like. So there's a gold capsule. Inside of the gold capsule, we add some powdered obsidian along with water. And then we cook them in these pressure vessels here. Now, after they're done, there's on the leftmost picture, there's the charges after the experiments. I open them, right, with pliers, and then in the far right picture, there's little chips of glass and some tweezers. And so I'll put these experimental run products on a microprobe and analyze them. So let me show you what we grew. So here are two experimental conditions. So we started below the liquidus in like our magma chamber scenario, and we started above the liquidus like Lofgren's experiments. And we actually used continuous decompression experiments. So let me show you what we ended up growing. So here's our first experimental condition. Pretend it's like a magma chamber where you have crystals stable and growing for a long time. Here's what we ended up growing. This is a BSE image, a backscatter electron image. The black is epoxy. The dark gray is glass. And if you see those whiskery looking things, they're light gray, those are actually little crystals. Lots of little tiny crystals, and they had a very small average size. And so what we learned from this is that decompression from a magma chamber, it resulted in extensive crystallization of teeny tiny crystals. And if you remember what our natural sample looked like, it wasn't that way at all. We had sparse large crystals in a sea of glass, no microlights. And so that didn't work at all, so we could just rule that out. The second experimental approach we used was to do this Lofgren-style experiment. So we started above the liquidus, and then we brought it down to a final condition, and we grew gigantic crystals of feldspar. And so that crystal is almost an order of magnitude bigger than those little crystals I showed before. And so we learned that decompression of a water-saturated melt from these superliquidus conditions, where there's no nucleation sites present, actually produce huge crystals. And so what we learned was that the way a melt crystallizes, right, its kinetics reflects its conditions before it crystallized, so super or subliquidus. If your melt starts below the liquidus, what will happen was there'd be extensive crystallization. If your melt begins above the liquidus, where there's no nucleation sites, you grow sparse large crystals. And so we kind of fill in the blanks here, and we say, this must be the reason that apatites have this behavior, and obsidians are able to to erupt with their crystalline load. So how does this happen in nature? So this is generally what it looks like, right? You have to start above the liquidus, but the Earth is full of rocks and minerals, right? So here's what it looks like. If you if you go to higher and higher pressures, you lose your bubbles, you lose your fluid phase, and your liquidus becomes backbending. You can begin above the liquidus, your obsidian melts form. As they decompress, they undergo superheating and they get rid of all their nucleation sites. And then they reach fluid saturation and degassing. And then you grow sparse, large crystals. And so it's this interval above the liquidus that permits eruption. So what does that look like in nature? You can imagine a magma chamber at depth, but there's no bubbles present. As this melt ascends, it undergoes a period of superheating, a purge of nucleation sites, and kinetically inhibited crystallization. And then this facilitates eruption. Now, on the other hand, aplites, they might begin the same way, but it's likely they begin in the presence of a fluid phase. Where you get rhyolites at subduction zones is from arc daceites. By the time these daceites have crystallized 50 to 70%, you have greater than 8 weight% water in the melt, so it exceeds the solubility limit in the upper crust, and therefore it stabilizes your nucleation sites. So as melts ascend, they freeze into place, and that prevents eruptions and coalescence into large batholiths. So what we learn is that continental crust does not develop a high silica layer because rhyolites at subduction zones form in the presence of a fluid phase, which stabilizes nucleation sites and facilitates crystallization. That means that these melts can freeze into place and they prevent coalescence of subduction zone. The big takeaway is that Earth does not form this high silica layer in its continents owing to the presence of water and subduction zone magmas. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and for the Smithsonian, the Peter Buck Fellowship, as well as my mentors here and at University of Michigan. I can repeat it too.
Great talk, Laura. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about because I work mostly on basalts, so not rhyolites, and I'm wondering if there's anything in the field relationships with where you see the aplites and where you see obsidians erupting. And I mean like on a large scale of where their occurrences are that would link to the hypothesis about water and about their decompression path or the depth of magma storage that you would need to go on those different ascent trajectories that end in eruption or crystallization underground.
Yes, so that's a great question. And where you get obsidians mostly are in rifts, and so you can find obsidians adjacent to like the Tuolumne batholith where those aplite dikes are, but that's in a place where there's typically lower water contents than, say, a subduction zone. So that's a great question, but they could also form deeper. There are chemical indexes you can look at, but they get obscured in terms of like bulk composition when you add CO2 to the system. So it's not just like there's no simple test. Thanks, Liz.
Continuing with the people in your from our department, asking you more questions. So when I think about Earth's surface, it's the most active surface in the index of rocky planets that we know about. We've got something like 30 kilometers worth of highly silica-rich sedimentary material that got removed from the Appalachians over the time period since the mountains reached their apex height. Do you think there's any relationship between the geochemical evidence of these rhyolitic materials not forming at the surface and the extent to which those materials can be preserved through those surface processes. Like, are they reinforcing one another potentially in a way that makes it even that much harder to find these outcrops in large scale?
So are you asking, like, basically if this high silica layer eroded off the top of the crust?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, so I would counter that with, like, or not counter, but just suggest that if you look at the record, the eruptive record in a subduction zone, it largely mirrors what's in a continent. And so even in, like, there's very, very few, even in the Cascades, like, volcanic fields that will produce rhyolite. And so there's only 3, and it's with incipient basin and range extension. And so if you look at, like, a histogram of the rocks in a subduction zone, the volcanic record, and compare it to the crust, it's not 1-to-1, but it's very similar. So the volcanics also suggest this is the case.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Hey, so I'm a petrologist as well, so I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. However, if I can, like, popularize the event a little bit. So imagine there is a planet where there are higher silica layers on that planet. And so I'm going to ask you to speculate, of course. What would that mean for, like, the hydrosphere or the atmosphere? Because we know, like, the salinity of the oceans are controlled by the silica content of the continents, or even, like, the weathering patterns, which control nutrient supply, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, if you had 100% silica layer or even lower, what would that mean for the hydrosphere?
So in a planetary, like, so what would it mean for the hydrosphere in general? But in a planetary perspective, based on this talk, if you were to develop that high silica layer, it's likely that you don't have water going down in a subduction zone, right? That would be, like, the first step. Is, like, to get that, you would have something that looked more like a rift, and where you have anhydrous, because it's that pesky fluid phase that's stabilizing nucleation sites and choking these minimum melts in their place. So if you were asking, like, would it be a great place to live? First pass, probably not. Like, there's probably not water for people there, would be my best guess, but yeah.
Water going down the subduction zones, presumably there's no plate tectonics as well, or it's very limited and stunted.
Yeah.
And that would mean there's no water cycle or CO2 drawdown.
But you can still get tectonics on, like Venus has tectonics, and so they, like, it just looks different.
It just wouldn't be a life-conducive planet.
That would be my best guess, but that is straight conjecture. Yeah.
Of
Thank
course,
you.
there's
Yeah.
a lot of other
Okay.
parameters. But
Yeah.
Thank
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for a fantastic talk. And Laura's former mentors, Ben Andrews and Liz Cottrell, are also in the audience. Very proud, no doubt.